Let's get started. Hello, my name is Reverend Jen Bailey. I am a 2016 Ashoka Fellow living in Nashville, Tennessee, and Executive Director of Faith Matters Network. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone to Welcome Change today. These are weekly conversations that Ashoka hosts among social entrepreneurs on what works, what's next, and the role that we all can play. I am thrilled. I'm over the moon. I am so excited to talk today to Reverend Heber Brown, who I've known for, almost nearly a decade, about his work with the Black Church Food Security Network. And we'll be talking for about 20 minutes or so, then opening up to questions from you all. So feel free to drop into the chat or in the Q&A function any questions that you have emerging. We're really excited to be in conversation with all of you today. So first and foremost, how you doing, friend? How is Baltimore today?
Baltimore is great today. A little cloudy out and some rain might be on the way, but my farmer friends have taught me that we give thanks for rain, especially when it's been dry for some time. But things are good. I feel good. It's so good to be with you and good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. So I've been following your work for a long time, but for some folks in the Ashoka community, they might be new to the work of the Black Church Food Security Network. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your story, how you started this amazing project, and what really inspired you to get it going.
Absolutely. So I'm a preacher's kid that has grown up in church and done a little bit of everything in the church, as my parents took us around to various ministries where my dad was preaching, or at the church where he pastors still to this day. And so coming from a family where my parents were in ministry leadership and are in ministry leadership, and then having many other relatives also in church leadership, it was almost set that I would have my own connection and deep connection with the church too. And so I became a pastor, just like my dad. And in my experience of pastoring, I just noticed a pattern of hospitalization in my church because of diet-related issues. And as a result of seeing that pattern, I wanted to do something more than just pray and give scriptures to people who were in the hospital. And upon learning that diet was a part of the equation while people were sick in the first place, I believe God gave the vision. I had an epiphany to start a garden on a part of the land that our church owned. And I did not realize how much that garden would transform our ministry. We saw many different benefits to growing our food at the church. That food was going to our congregational meals. It was going to members of the congregation. And it prompted so many positive and favorable health benefits, but also benefits as it relates to community and benefits as it relates to seeing the gifts in one another better. So many things happened that eventually I said, you know what if this dynamic experience that we're having at our church, what if we could replicate this at other churches, and particularly at Black churches that have languished for generations under the weight of oppressive policies related to food, zoning laws that kept us away from the food that we need in our community, and so much more. And so that's a little bit of the backdrop about why, and then how I just started calling to my clergy colleagues, or churches heard about our work and they called us and said, hey, can we link up with this effort that y'all are doing, starting gardens at churches? And I said, sure, let's do it. And the network, the Black Church Food Security Network, grew from that point, with the focus on African-American churches. And that's on purpose. But I think we'll get to why that. But today, our network is 225 member churches across the country, of all sizes, of all denominations, more than 125 Black farmers. And I get the awesome joy and privilege of being a people pollinator, connecting churches, farmers, and communities to co-create Black food ecosystems in places that have struggled with food apartheid.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit of the context of your work. Both of us belong to and are inheritors of the Black church tradition, as it were. I'm ordained in the AME church. And one of the things that I think is true about the Black church tradition, and always has been, which folks may not know, is that the Black church has never just been a space of spiritual sort of growth and sustenance for folks, but it has been a center of community, right? And so I'm really curious, as we think about the legacy of the Black church tradition, as a alternative space for, in particular, African-American folks to access things like healthy food, to access things like credit, to access things like childcare. I wonder if you could speak to how the work of the Black Church Food Security Network is part of an ongoing legacy of work that we're carrying forward.
Thank you, Reverend Jen. Yeah, that's such a good question. When people think about the Black church, some people think about the Black church in the context of an individual that they know, like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And unfortunately, the dominant narratives around Dr. King make him some solitary individual, some superhero that all by himself, created this magnificent change that we see in the nation and in the world. But to understand people like Dr. King or even Malcolm X, people like Mary McLeod Bethune, people like Frederick Douglass, to understand them in context is to understand that they were a part of congregations, Black Christian congregations, who understood their spiritual vocation to have connection to social change and social justice as well. And so Black church communities have worked together to bring about things like the Voting Rights Act, like civil rights. Like, we need to think about civil rights history as one example. We need to think about civil rights history as a part of Black church history, because those black and white videos that we see when we see civil rights scenes and episodes, they're filled with members of Black churches who had just had prayer meeting in the sanctuary before they marched out on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Or who just had a strategy meeting in the church basement before they, launched out to march downtown. And so I think it's important for us to reconsider what we think we know about things like the civil rights movement, things like the Civil War, that the AME church was very much so engaged in Civil War activities, Underground Railroad. You almost don't have an Underground Railroad without the African Methodist Episcopal Church and without the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And so I love Reverend Jen's expanding our understanding of Black churches as anchor institutions in Black America, and also anchor institutions in the nation as well, even if Black churches don't get credit for all the things that we have done over the years. So what we're doing in the food justice space is a continuation. We're just hitching our caboose to this centuries-long train that the Black church has been engaged in, supporting our communities and seeing the benefit of connecting with an existing network with a heritage that runs deep in the literal and figurative soil of our nation.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because I do think it's so important that folks understand our work in context, that it is, again, I wouldn't call you a caboose, Heber. I would call you one of the boxcars, because there are people who are now hitching themselves and they're into the work that you've built. But it is a long train. And I think that notion of intergenerationality and understanding what it means to inherit a lineage, but also pass one down, is so essential to an fundamental understanding of who the Black church is and who the church continues to be. Big C, Black church. One of the things that is true, and I don't know if you know this about me, but I actually started my career in the food justice movement. So I started right after undergrad as a Bill Emerson National Hunger Fellow, and then worked for several years running a food stamp outreach and advocacy program here in Nashville before starting Faith Matters Network. One of the things that was really apparent to me as I was in sort of the space of food justice and food insecurity, working predominantly with communities of color in that context and Black communities here in Nashville, was just the ways in which people, and I'm curious about your thoughts here, had these ways of knowing about the soil. So you had elders who were food insecure, who had these sort of memories of working the soil, which is true of my own family, but didn't necessarily pass that knowledge down to generations that followed. And I know in the story of my own, I had two grandmothers, one that lived in southern rural town in Illinois, the other one in the south side of Chicago. Both of them had plentiful vegetable gardens because they came from folks who grew, but didn't pass down that tradition necessarily to their grandchildren. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how your work is helping redeem the soil from some of the ancestral traumas that can have been attached to Black folks, in particular, relationship to land in America and forced labor on land.
Yeah, thank you for that, Reverend Jen. I think one of the things that comes to mind to me is oftentimes when I do presentations about the relationship between people of African descent and the land and farming, I reach far back beyond slavery. And that serves in part as an important corrective, as an important healing space when it comes to our relationship with the land and with soil. So when people hear, oftentimes for the first time during my presentation, that in West Africa, wisdom and science around agriculture began really becoming defined in like 3500 BCE. And that it became known in many parts of the world that there were these agricultural geniuses in West Africa that people were learning from or trying to connect with. And that knowledge and that wisdom is actually a part of what put a target on our backs for the European slave trade of African people. It can help to give us a different starting point. I think if chattel slavery remains the starting point for how we understand Black people and the land, of course, it's going to foment and reinforce trauma because of the nightmare of that experience of chattel slavery. And so I think it's important to reach back, number one. And then number two, I think it's important when we're trying to engage and make room for the movement of that trauma. I think it's important to remember that it was never the land that enslaved us. I remember that, when Reverend Richard Joyner, who's a farmer and preacher in Canitas, North Carolina, he tells the story about when his dad was farming and he was helping his dad. He became of age and he wanted to leave. And it kind of pointed to that break that you just talked about, Reverend Jen. And he remembers confronting his dad about, why stay down here? Why keep farming? And his father told him, son, the land never enslaved us. He said, the white man stole from us. It was not the land. And then when I read stories and essays from people like Bell Hooks, who write so poetically about the relationship between people of African descent and the land, it helps to create space for healing around our relationship with land and soil, that I think the embers are there. So when you talk about your relatives and other elders who have these stories, the embers are still there, that with some fanning will grow even bigger in terms of our reconnection and remembering community-wide in terms of our relationship with the land. I'd say super quickly as well, it also is important to not only talk about chattel slavery with respect to being a driver for this traumatic connection to land and soil that many Black people have, but we don't even have to go back that far to point to traumatic experiences. I think about people like Ida B. Wells.
Yes.
And she goes on this campaign against lynching because she had three friends who had a grocery store in Memphis, Tennessee, and that grocery store was right across from the white man's grocery store. Well, these three Black brothers in their grocery store was doing so well that the white owner of the grocery store became incensed and organized a mob that ultimately lynched the three Black owners of this grocery store in Memphis, Tennessee. And that set Ida B. Wells off on a course to challenge lynching in this country. Those are the kinds of, also the kinds of stories that lend themselves to trauma that have contributed to this disconnection, but even to this very day, gentrification, eminent domain. It's a contested space when it comes to Black people and land. that we have to speak plainly about, I believe, as well.
Beautiful, beautiful. That makes me think a little bit as we're reflecting, and then we're going to shift because we have so many amazing questions that are popping up already in the chat. Your vision of the land never enslaved us is really hitting me hard, because I'm just thinking about the ways in which our ancestors looked to the stars because they were violently severed from their homeland by being brought here in such a violent way. So what is it for them to be on soil that is not necessarily their indigenous soil, but is as a place to connect to Earth as mother, as cosmic? You got me going, Rev. I got a sermon in me about that. The soil never enslaved us. Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
I have a couple of questions that have begun to pop up in the chat that I'm just going to ask about. The first one is this: how do you move from the what would happen if to taking steps of actually doing it as a team in the context of the church? How do you move from that place of sort of what would happen to actually doing it as a team?
Yeah, that's what we've been living for the past going on 8 years. And the way that it is happening now is through the existing network of Black church communities. So the Black church community already acts as a network when it comes to conferences and concerts, when it comes to revivals. It already moves in such a way where relationships cross-congregationally are formed and deepened to produce or create a certain thing. All we're doing is injecting into the veins of that existing network this focus around food, which isn't hard because food is always a part, whether it's a Black church or not. Food is a part of many of our faith communities, almost like a religious relic of many of our religious communities. And so the work that we do is not, I never like, Reverend Jen, I don't like being propped up like, oh, we've never seen this before. He is so unique. I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, stop playing. I just read the footnotes of our history and pay attention to how people already move, pay attention to how this network is already operating in terms of the church and the Black church specifically, and just adding to it to help people and help churches be more of who they've always been. So churches have always cared about food. I'm just saying food pantries will never get us to a place of having power with respect to our health environments. And so can we take that pantry and pivot it? And now instead of getting food from big box stores, can we buy it from local farmers and growers? And you can still continue to do the thing that you're doing, just do it with equity and justice and agency in mind, and not just charity by itself. And so to land the plane of that question real quick, our organization, we work with churches to start gardens on their land, to host Black farmers markets on Sundays, because right after church, everybody's hungry.
Yes.
To help churches buy in bulk from Black farmers and even do Black farm tours so that people get a chance to get their feet on sacred soil and local farms. So this has moved far beyond the what if to what is. And I see one of the other questions, and so it connects well. One of the parts of the what is that though we have 225 some plus churches in our network, most of our churches are along Interstate I-95 along the East Coast. And most of our Black farmer relationships are also along the East Coast of the country. What we are actively doing right now is going from church to church and farm to farm along Interstate I-95, and in a bottom-up grassroots role-making way, seeing how do we connect these farms and these churches in these various cities so that we can work together to create a systems solution to food apartheid in our community. This looks like us, an Earth Day weekend of this year, we launched a 50-tree fruit tree orchard in Jacksonville, Florida.
Amazing.
So excited. Lemons, tangerines, oranges. We are growing our own stuff, Reverend Jen.
Yummy.
So I go to Buffalo, New York, and I tell our members in Buffalo about what we just did in Florida. And they said, we want an orchard too. And a pastor stood up and a farmer stood up. The farmer said, I'll give you land to do an orchard in Buffalo. And another pastor said, I'll give you money to support the orchard. And now there's a 50-tree food forest coming in Buffalo, New York. So from Buffalo to Florida and every point in between, these kinds of creative ecosystems and connections are popping up. And again, we're just pollinating the experiences up and down and doing stuff like asking who has a pickup truck, who has land for cold storage, who knows farmers in the community. And so it's a very grassroots, values-based connecting of where our churches and farmers are along the East Coast. And we're excited about that work.
It's beautiful. It reminds me of just the I-95 is symbolic of sort of freedom's highway, right? People coming out and get from the South up north and back. And so that notion of connecting again back to lineage and back to this broader story of how we connect to our story. My people are from Northern Florida and Southern Georgia, so I love to hear.
Very cool.
I love to hear that good work is happening in that corridor and part of the country. Lots of other questions here. So I'm going to tie two questions together. There's one about what is the relation between religion and the abundance and deep-rooted relationships the Black church has built throughout the years. So that framework of abundance and relationship. And I'll tie that also to the way that you see spiritual leaders connecting people to make social change, because I do think that there's something, I feel that first question feels like a theological question to me, right? And the second is sort of the implications of that theology, right? How we see it manifest in the lives of spiritual leaders.
Sure. Well, I'll say very quickly, because that first question could be a seminary course all by itself.
Yes. I was thinking the same thing, Reverend. I was like, maybe we co-teach that class sometime.
That's right. We can do it. I'm down. Let's do it. I'll say quickly that I am proud to be a part of a communal, cultural, and religious tradition of people who have had to make a way out of no way.
Yes. People
who have had to look at what is, pray to a God that can bless what is, and trust God to provide what needs to be for their community. And so in a way, in this moment, I think about how I come from folk who've not had the luxury to think through deficit lenses. Because if I stay in a deficit space, I'm not going to survive. We've had to think about what is the abundance that can be connected to hand-me-down clothes and sandwiches with no meat, and sharing bath water, and all knowing plants by sight. Out of necessity, we've had to connect with an abundance that goes beyond capitalism and the market, and goes deeper into relationship and connection. So that's a thought that comes to mind, but so much more can be said there. But Black churches are spaces where that kind of belief and that kind of trust has always found a home. I mean, I'm thinking about songs we would sing saying, I know the Lord will make a way. Yes, he will. That kind of thing has always been a part. And I think in terms of seeing spiritual leaders connecting people to social change, spiritual leaders, many of the spiritual leaders that I'm blessed to be in relationship with do not have PR teams or marketing firms or social media teams to broadcast everything that's done. In fact, that's not even the motivation. And so the thinking around doing that is not even there. I'd venture to say that there is more work being done by spiritual leaders all the time to connect, support, nurture, resource people as they link with social change movements. And we have recent examples of that with the summer of 2020. Yes. I know pastors who were on the front lines of marches and movements all over the nation, opening their churches for people who needed spaces to rest and find a sense of community and support. That's happening all the time, including in this very moment. And if you want to get an example of that, Reverend Jen, right on the screen. If you want to see a spiritual leader doing those kinds of connections, Reverend Jen is right here, and her work is also very celebrated for that kind of engagement as well.
Oh, thank you for that, Corinne. You already moving people. Susie Wise is asking, are you interested in potential West Coast network as well? Some of us here from Oakland, California, maybe connecting to that pattern of the Great Migration to the West Coast. So I'm curious about where expansion might lie as you think about the network's growth.
Absolutely. So yes, the short answer is yes. Yes, we do have a couple of member churches in LA. And I have a love for Oakland, so I'd love to connect. We also have a sister organization called Green the Church, Reverend Ambrose Carroll and the wonderful team he has with his organization. We love to link up on the West Coast. I'm excited to be heading to New Orleans this weekend. We'll be at Essence Festival next week, 500,000 Black women in Louisiana. And we're going to spread the word, which is really exciting because we don't have deep roots in that part of the country. I'm ready.
Go to Auntie Fest and live your
Say it
life.
again.
I said you better go to Auntie Fest and live your life.
Auntie Fest is going to be amazing. And we're excited about that. So yeah, I'm ready to go anywhere. I will just say very quickly that for us, relationship is key, you know, and so some of the ways that this happens is, yes, we have an online forum for churches that want to join or Black farmers that want to connect or people that want to support. You just go to blackchurchpower.com or go to blackchurchfoodsecurity.net. Put that in your website and come on up and you'll kind of get information there. But I will say, Reverend Jen, that we do move at the speed of trust.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is not a microwave movement.
Exactly.
And I'm accountable to too many people, pastors and congregations and communities, to try to just put this together real quick, to profit myself and put my name out there. I know that this work that I'm doing right now, that when I breathe my last breath and return to the sacred soil, that if I do it right, there'll be so much more yet to do. I want to die pointing in the direction of where it is that I think we need to go as a community, knowing full well that others will come behind and improve, critique, correct, and strengthen this work. But being buried, anchoring this work in the soil in the bosom of Black churches, for me, means that when I'm dead and gone, these institutions that have been around for 300 some years have a better shot at standing firm in this food justice movement far into the future than my meager and mere life has. And so that is on purpose too. And so I say all that to say, let's break bread. Yeah. Let me hear about your grandmama Nim. Let me tell you about my children. And let's move at the speed of relationship and trust when connecting in those ways too.
Beautiful, beautiful. We're almost at time and there's still some wonderful questions coming in the chat. I don't know if you want to offer just quick responses to these. I know we only got a minute. What can other churches and congregations learn from the Black church? I think we've talked a little bit about that, but much to learn. And then this last question, many youth are no longer finding home within traditional religious communities. What are you seeing related to youth, faith and spirituality and social action and your context? And we'll use that as sort of a benediction moment before I dismiss us.
That's perfect. So I'll say super quickly that as an elder millennial, and I was informed that I'm an elder, we are elder millennials.
We're elder millennials.
We serve a very important function in this society, I believe. Many of us happen to be bridge people. So we are old enough to remember the ways of some of those who are older than us and appreciate it, and also young enough to be able to connect with younger people and remember our very critiques of traditional faith communities as well. I think if we stand firm in this particular generational kind of place as bridges in this way, it will help to help more younger people find home. But also we are in position now as leaders. I remember, Jim, when we started, we was the young ones coming out.
Yes.
Now we got a couple titles, got a couple degrees, got some juice and credibility. Yeah. Some of these critiques that are raised up by younger people, we are in position to, number one, affirm, but also change and correct and challenge too. I'll say that. And other benediction about other faith communities. Yeah, I'm blooming where I was planted, the Black church community. But what I am doing, and very much so, I pray there's transferable wisdom to other faith communities, other community organizations as well. I love the work of Cormac Russell and others that talk about asset-based community development, Ella Baker on community organizing. This is transferable wisdom. My canvas is the Black church, but please do not think this is limited to the Black church. Yeah. The bigger, larger wisdom can cross cultural, religious, continental connections and distinctions as well.
Beautiful. Heber, this has been wonderful. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. Please look out for an email with today's link to today's conversations. You can also check links from Ashoka in the chat to find out how you can follow Heber and myself. And we'll see you next week for Welcome Change. Thank you so much, Heber. We gotta connect, man. I'm gonna call you. We gotta
I know.
So wonderful to be with you all today. Take care, everybody.